Books are better than movies. And before I accidentally hurt anyone's feelings or start some kind of war, just know this title is a little bit of a clickbait. It is true, I will be talking about a way that I think books are superior to movies, but I'm not talking about them in a whole. I think they're both incredibly valuable art forms, and I love them all. Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. But here is one specific way I think books are superior to movies that I did not realize until recently. You probably have books. You have access to movies. Here's what I mean by that. If you have any books at all, they're almost certainly printed. You could definitely have an ebook, but most of your books traditionally are going to be printed and they're taking up physical space in your house, as you definitely know if you've ever had to move apartments. Movies, on the other hand, unless you're holding a DVD or you still have a VHS of Inspector Gadget 2, which you forgot to return to Blockbuster when you were a kid and now you can't, you probably access your movies through a streaming service, or maybe you've bought them but you own them digitally. Of course, you could have physical DVDs, but for most of us, that's not representative of most of the movies you've seen. You don't own most of the movies you've seen, whereas unless you're in the habit of giving your books away as soon as you've read them, you probably own many of the books you've read. Now, you might think you know where I'm going with this, so stop. You don't. Or you do, maybe you do. I'm not going to say something about the aesthetics or the physicality of it or the feel of the pages make you just feel so good, and the movie just can't immerse you in the same way. I think those are all pretty valid, and we actually will probably talk about them in a later video, but that's not what I'm talking about here. The reason I think it's important to physically have books, what that does for you, has everything to do with your memory. Think about the difference between the photos you have hanging on the wall of your house versus the photos you have in your camera roll. They are both accessible at any time, right? Actually, you could argue the photos on your phone are more accessible because you have your phone with you wherever you go, and the photos at your home you can only see when you're at home in that room. But the key difference is being reminded. A physical picture on the wall you see every time you walk through your house, and you remember that moment. If you have a physical bookshelf in your house, it's functioning the same way a gallery of photos on your wall is functioning. Whenever you walk past it, you see, oh, hey, there's a couple books. Now, of course, you can go and open them at any time, but even without it, looking at the covers reminds you of whatever you learned from that book. And this is not to say like you can't remember the movies you've seen. Of course you can remember the movies you've seen. Like if I said specifically, have you seen, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, you would say, oh yes, of course. But you're less likely to remember unprompted. And most of life we go unprompted. I guess this video could probably be retitled Why You Should Have a Very Big DVD Shelf in Your House and also a bookshelf. But this is a video series about books, so we're gonna talk about books for now. So I just walked past my bookshelf a couple minutes ago and I pulled off a couple books that triggered random memories. And it's not that I forgot I had read these, it just no one had asked me if I had read them in a long time. Luckily, I had my bookshelf to do that. Okay, the first book that I saw that triggered my memory is a book called Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, and it reminded me of three things in this order. The first one is my Aunt Becky, and that I need to play her back in Words with Friends because she's the one who recommended this book to me, and so whenever I see it, I think of my Aunt Becky, and I think there could be worse things in life than having objects around your house that remind you to catch up with your family. So that's a win right there, regardless of the contents of the book, right? Number two is writing. I like it, and I would like to get back into it. More than the writing tips inside the book, I just remembered I like writing, and there was a time in my life pretty recently when I bought that book to get better. So maybe I should try that again. And then thirdly, and finally, were the actual writing tips on the inside of the book. And honestly, they're kind of fuzzy. I remember like some examples, I remember liking it and learning it, but I can open the book if I want. There's not a test. There's no contest to see who can remember the most books without looking. And the first two things on the list, I didn't need to open the book to remember. I didn't need to open the book to remember that I like Aunt Becky and I need to play her back in Words with Friends and she likes to write, and I didn't need to open the book to remember that I like to write. But those thoughts weren't on my mind until I passed my shelf. This doesn't even have to be about books you've read. It can be about books you've bought and have been meaning to read. Imagine you've got a picture on your wall of a place you've not been yet. That can still remind you that you want to go to that place or that you've heard about that place and it's kind of cool. Same way if you have a book on your shelf that you've not got to yet, but you've been meaning to, seeing it on your shelf is a way to remind you, as opposed to the movies that you haven't seen, which just kind of exist in space. In Steal Like an Artist, Austin Kleon, who I quoted last week, says, collect books even if you don't plan on reading them right away. Nothing is more important than an unread library. The physical nature of books being present in your house, in your space, to remind you of what you learned or of what you want to learn is one way I think books are superior to movies in this present day and age. Now, a reminder is not the same as action, right? Like looking at the book, The Richest Man in Babylon, is not going to make me better financially, just looking at it. But it is going to remind me that I care about that. And a reminder is better than nothing at all. I had some students ask me recently how often I think about the Roman Empire. I know that's like a thing going around, but the funny thing is, like, I think about it all the time. And the reason I think about it all the time is I have a copy of Meditations and I pass it all the time. And I've read it once in college and I read it once since. It's not even that long of a book, but I've thought about it like 300 times because I pass it. I still remember so many key points from that book, like, hey, get up early, you're not an animal, you're a man, go do your work. Or, hey, you should spend money on books, which we'll get to that in a later video, right? Things like that, they come to me regularly because I pass my bookshelf and he's on it. All right, do me a favor, walk past your bookshelf and see which of those pictures, those snapshots, remind you of something. And then come comment what the book was and what you learned from it or what it reminded you of. And I'll be super happy to hear it and love to talk to you about it. Have a great life, and I'll see you in Reasons to Read number 3.